Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Goodbye, Mr. Chips, written by James Hilton, Chapter 7, read by Muhammad Afzal for second year students. And so it stood, a warm and vivid patch in his life, casting a radiance that glowed in 1,000 recollections. Twilight at Mrs. Wickett's, when the school bell clanged for call over, brought them back to him in a cloud. Catherine scampering along the stone corridors, laughing beside him at some howler in an essay he was marking, taking the cello part in a Mozart trio for the school concert, her creamy arm sweeping over the bronze sheen of the instrument. She had been a good player and a fine musician, and Catherine furred and muffed for the December house matches. Catherine at the garden party that followed speech day prize giving, Catherine tendering her advice in any little problem that arose. Good advice, too, which he did not always take, but which always influenced him. Chips, dear, I will let them off if I were you. After all, it was nothing very serious. I know I would like to let them off, but if I do, I'm afraid they will do it again. Try telling them that, frankly, and give them the chance. I might. And there were other things occasionally that were serious. Chips, having all these hundreds of boys cooped up here is really an unnatural arrangement when you come to think about it. So that when anything does occur that oughtn't to, don't you think it is a bit unfair to come down on them as if it were their own fault for being here? Don't know about that, Kathy, but I do know that for everybody's sake, we have to be pretty strict about this sort of thing. One black sheep can contaminate others after he himself has been contaminated to begin with. After all, that's what probably did happen, isn't it? Maybe. We can't help it. Anyhow, I believe Brookfield is better than a lot of other schools. All the more reason to keep it so. But this boy, Chips, you are going to sack him? The head probably will, when I tell him. And you are going to tell the head. It's a duty, I'm afraid. Couldn't you think about it a bit? Talk to the boy again. Find out how it began. After all, apart from this business, isn't he rather a nice boy? Oh, he's all right. Then, Chips dear, don't you think there ought to be some other way? And so on. About once in 10 times he was adamant and wouldn't be persuaded. In about half of these exceptional cases, he afterwards rather wished he had taken her advice. And years later, whenever he had trouble with the boy, he was always at the mercy of a softening wave of reminiscence. The boy would stand there, waiting to be told his punishment, and would see if he were observant. The brown eyes twinkled into a shine that told him all was well. But he did not guess that at such a moment Chips was remembering something that had happened long before he was born. That Chips was thinking, young ruffian, I'm hanged if I can think of any reason to let him off, but I'll bet she would have done. But she had not always pleaded for leniency. On rather rare occasions, she eyed severity where Chips was inclined to be forgiving. I don't like his type. Chips, he is too cocksure of himself. If he is looking for trouble, I should certainly let him have it. What a host of little incidents, all deep buried in the past. problems that had once been urgent, arguments that had once been keen, anecdotes that were funny only because one remembered the fun. Did any emotion really matter when the last trace of it had vanished from human memory? And if that were so, what a crowd of emotions clung to him as to their last home before annihilation. He must be kind to them, must treasure them in his mind before their long sleep. That affair of Archer's resignation, for instance, a queer business that was. And that affair about the rat that Dunster put in the organ loft while old Ogilvy was taking choir practice. Ogilvy was dead and Dunster drowned at Jutland. Of course, who had witnessed or heard of the incident, probably most had forgotten. And it had been like that with other incidents for centuries. He had a sudden vision of thousands and thousands of boys from the age of Elizabeth onwards, dynasty upon dynasty of masters, long epochs of Brookfield history that had left not even a ghostly record. Who knew why the old fifth form room was called the pit? There was probably a reason to begin with, but it had since then been lost. Lost like the lost books for Livy. And what happened at Brookfield when Cromwell fought at Naseby, nearby? How did Brookfield react to the great scare of the 45? Was there a whole holiday when news came of Waterloo? And so on, up to the earliest time that he himself could remember, 1870, and whether by saying by way of small talk after their first and only interview, looks as if we shall have to settle with the Prussians ourselves one of these fine days. When Chips remembered things like this, he often felt that he would write them down and make a book of them. And during his years at Mrs. Wickett's, he sometimes went even so far as to make desultory notes in an exercise book. But he was soon brought up against difficulties, the chief one being that writing tired him, both mentally and physically. Somehow, too, his recollections lost much of their flavor when they were written down. That story about Ruston and the sack of potatoes, for instance, it would seem quite tame in print, but Lord, how funny it had been at the time. It was funny too to remember it, though perhaps if you didn't remember Ruston, and who would anyway, after all these years? It was such a long time ago, Mrs. Wickett. Did you ever know a fellow named Ruston? Before your time, I dare say, went to Burma in some government job, or was it Bernoy? Very funny fellow, Ruston. And there he was, dreaming again before the fire, dreaming of times and incidents in which he alone could take secret interest. Funny and sad, comic and tragic. They all mixed up in his mind, and someday, however hard it proved, he would sort them out and make a book of them. End of chapter 7, read by Muhammad Afzal for second year students.